This guy is the strongest healer on the entire continent. In the final battle against the Calamity, none of the hunters were strong enough to take down the dragons, but they had will. And with will around, nobody died on the battlefield, no matter how bad the injuries were. But that turned out to be a curse. His allies got fed up with not being able to die. Being pulled back from death, patched up from scratch, and thrown back into the war over and over again was worse than just falling in battle. So, they turned against the only one keeping them alive. The general drove a sword into Will's shoulder and said, "Now you know what it feels like to suffer." That was the end. With no will to fight, the army fell apart. The dragons didn't let anyone walk away. And Will found out that even the strongest healer in the world doesn't make it out of a dragon's stomach alive. But you think that's it? Will wakes up 5 years in the past with every single memory of the apocalypse still in his head. He knows exactly what's coming. And this time, he decided he's not going to stay in the back just healing people. He's going to learn how to fight, get into the offensive magic academy, and stop relying on everyone else to protect the people he cares about until he notices the letter on the table, the enrollment form. If it was there, then it meant he had actually gone back in time. Will opens the door and faces the world outside year 416 of the Salserio calendar, 1 week before the enrollment date at HEALER Academy, 5 years ago. He had thought the dragon took his life. He doesn't know what happened, but if his last wish was truly granted, then he knows exactly what he needs to do. He's going to enroll at Schwarz, the offensive magic academy. It was common knowledge that healers couldn't use attack magic. Will intended to shatter that idea once and for all. There would be obstacles, plenty of them, but he carried the memories of his past life and all the healing magic he had mastered in it. If he used everything he had, he could change the future. This time, he would fight with his own hands. Schwarz was the best school in the world for learning battle magic. They said the elite system there could turn any mage into a frontline combatant. Someone he had met in his past life was also a graduate, but the academy's theories were kept under tight wraps. Only students had access. There was probably no precedent for a healer enrolling at Schwarz. The question was how to get around that. In the end, it might come down to money. Because of the school's reputation, nobles invested heavily in it. If only he had managed to bring his fortune from his past life. But no. Either way, the reward he received as a healer was generous. The problem was time. Even if he started working now, he wouldn't earn enough before the enrollment date. A voice calls his name. Will recognizes it immediately, his sister. He had gone back to the past, and she was still alive. She asks if his stomach was hurting. Will shakes his head, saying some dust got in his eye. She laughs and wishes him a good day. Will thinks that in this life, he can prevent the tragedy that happens to her later. His healing magic would be enough. He can save the people he couldn't save before. He says he found something out. His sister wants to know what's going on. The Magic Academy Alliance was an organization that brought together all the MIs in the kingdom and made decisions about magical education. At that time, the president of the alliance also served as the director of Schwarz Academy. But there was a period when he practically vanished from the meetings. At the director's estate that same day, he was standing beside a bed. His granddaughter lay unconscious, drenched in cold sweat. He rests his hand on her face and calls her name Marie. He says today's healer wasn't good enough either, but that he will find someone capable of curing her. He asked her to hold on a little longer. That was why the president kept disappearing. He was completely consumed with caring for his sick granddaughter. In the previous timeline, the healing magic of the era hadn't been able to save her, and she had died. Then someone comes in through the window and asks if the director would be willing to let him take care of that job. The director recognizes the boy right away. It was Will, the scholarship student from HEALER, whose talent in healing magic was well known within the Alliance, though he hadn't expected him to be the type who climbs in through windows. Will scratches his head and laughs. He thinks his past self would never have done something like that, but losing a life might have made him bolder. Either way, there's no time to waste. Not for him, not for the girl, and he can heal her. The director asks what his intentions are. Will says they can talk about that later, and that first he needs permission to treat his granddaughter. The illness has progressed faster than he expected. The two stare at each other for a few seconds. Then, the director gives in and tells Will to show him what he's got. Will sits beside the girl on the bed and looks ahead, a little tense. He thinks the director of an offensive magic academy has exactly the kind of eyes you'd expect. The type that ends your life on the spot if you make one wrong move. Even so, he takes a deep breath, holds her hand, and starts using his healing magic. His mana capacity dropped when he came back to the past, but the formulas he still remembers. The formula to treat Zora's illness wasn't supposed to be discovered for another 2 years, but his current self already knows it. The girl opens her eyes. Will lets out a relieved sigh and says, "Thank God it worked." With a smile, he tells her that her stamina is completely drained and asks her to rest. She turns away slightly embarrassed and agrees. The director asks if Marie is really okay. She confirms it and says she can't remember the last time she felt this light. The old man nearly bursts into tears on the spot. He says he understands. He understands completely and that it's an enormous relief. In another room, the director thanks Will. He says that if there's anything he can do for him, all he has to do is ask. Will thanks him and says the request isn't a hard one. As the director just saw, his healing magic is top tier. There's nothing left for him to learn in that field. That's why he wants to enroll in Schwarz Academy. The director asks if Will really wants to put a talent like his into an offensive magic academy instead of a healing one, and whether he understands what that means. Will confirms it. The director studies the boy's eyes for a moment. Then he says his authority exists for exactly days like this one, and that he'll take care of everything. He shakes Will's hand. In another room, a man remarks that old fox, when you least expect it, goes and does something so reckless. He wonders if Will can even keep up with Schwarz's curriculum, a soft healer like him. On the day of the entrance ceremony, the director gives a speech in front of everyone. Schwarz Academy is a boarding school specializing in offensive magic with a unique curriculum, vast grounds, numerous training fields, research facilities, and a massive library. It boasts influential alumni and receives direct support from the kingdom. There is no better institution to learn offensive magic. No healer had ever enrolled there. The director is certain that many hardships await Will, but if he studies at this academy, he will be able to become a true mage. Will thinks about his past. Here, in this place, he will change his destiny. After enrollment and classes begin, Will runs into his first obstacle. A professor tells him to start. Will agrees, conjures a fire spell in the palm of his hand, and fires, but only smoke comes out. The professor declares it another failure. He says he can't let Will attend class until he can hit a target with basic offensive magic and tells him to go practice at the training fields behind the school. Will excuses himself and asks if the professor can at least teach him how to do it. There's no way to practice something he doesn't know. The professor replies that teaching a healer is nothing but a waste of time. Will asked if he could at least study theory in the library, but the professor was blunt. There were no books for healers there. That was when a blonde student cast a spell without warning and fired straight at him. Will hit the ground. The blonde laughed, asking if he couldn't even dodge a basic attack. This was an offensive magic academy. There was no place for weaklings who didn't even know how to protect themselves. In other words, it was his own fault for taking a hit. The professor agreed with the student. He said Will should ask the Healer Academy to take him back. The blonde finished with a smile, saying that at least over there he'd find people kind enough to comfort him. Will got up and looked back with hatred on his face. Later, sitting on a bench outside, Will faced reality. There was no sign of progress in offensive magic. He knew it would be hard. Healing magic and offensive magic draw from completely different sources. Mages convert mana using spell formulas, and the type of mana defines what they can do. Dynamic mana produces fire, explosions, destruction. Healers only possess static mana, but Schwarz had a reputation for forging top-tier battle mages out of almost nothing. There had to be some method here. If he could learn to convert static mana into dynamic, he was confident he could master the rest. The problem was that getting anywhere near the classes wasn't even possible. Professors and students looked down on healers equally. Even so, he couldn't give up. The person he admired had started with little mana and refined everything right there at Schwarz. Coming here hadn't been a mistake. Struggling in the dark wasn't going to get him anywhere either. He didn't have permission to enter the library, but maybe it was worth trying to sneak in. A voice cut through the silence, asking what he was doing outside at that hour. Will apologized automatically and then recognized the person in front of him. She came closer, looking down, then raised her eyes and met Will's gaze directly. It was Lady Veronica. He felt the weight of that encounter. In his past life, they had fought on the same battlefield. She was a first-class battle mage, and in the final moments, they had been together. Her magic sword could cut through anything in an instant. And now, in this life, he had the chance to meet her again. That was when he noticed. She had her sword in hand. Veronica said she had spotted a suspicious student, and it was only natural to be on guard. She wanted to know what he was up to, whether he was plotting something or just eager to learn. Will assess the situation in a split second. Veronica was on a completely different level from Opulpus. If she attacked, he was done. He answered that it was just eagerness. She put the sword away, said that was fine. Then Will confirmed her name and Veronica agreed, but wanted to know if that was how he addressed a professor. Will was surprised. In his past life, the age gap between them hadn't been that wide. Veronica explained that she had skipped grades and become a professor shortly after starting that very year. Given her talent, it made complete sense. And that was when Will saw the opportunity. He asked if he could attend her classes and how he would go about signing up. Veronica replied that she didn't have her own class yet. She had skipped grades and barely attended regular classes herself. That year, she was only a teaching assistant assigned to answer students' questions. The idea was that being close in age, students would feel more comfortable around her. For some reason, though, no one ever asked her anything. Perfect. Well, got straight to the point. If a healer wanted to learn offensive magic, what did she think he should do? Veronica said she had noticed something strange in his mana flow. So, it was him, the newcomer everyone had been talking about. A healer learning offensive magic was a rare thing, but if there was any method for handling dynamic mana, she could certainly teach it to him. Will was surprised, but Veronica continued without hesitation. Even so, it would be impossible for him to use offensive magic. He had far too much static mana. Even if he managed to forge dynamic mana, it would simply dissolve into the static. And even using an alternative method, the formula wouldn't work. Will asked directly whether there was no method at all for a healer to use offensive magic. Veronica said no. He took any answer. The plan had fallen apart, but giving up there wasn't an option. If no method existed, he would have to create one himself. He thanked Veronica and said he would think it over more on his own. Veronica said she wasn't done yet. It was true that healers couldn't use offensive magic, but there was a way for a healer to become a battle mage. Will didn't understand what she meant by that. Veronica pointed to the sword at her own waist. Swing it like this, and you can take down an enemy. Then she pointed to the chair beside her made of wood built for sitting. But if someone picked it up and threw it at another person, it would knock them down with ease. Nobody thinks of using a chair as a weapon because it was made for something else. How it's used depends on who's holding it. And the same went for her hand. She could give him a light touch. Will was caught off guard. Then Veronica flicked him on the forehead and said she could hurt him that way, too. In short, it all came down to application. Anything could become a weapon, depending on how it was used. Will got it right away. She was talking about using healing magic to attack. Veronica confirmed it with a nod. He couldn't understand why he'd never thought of that before. He'd never even considered the possibility. Veronica explained that was exactly what defined each person's nature. That's why battle mages had no interest in healing and healers had no interest in combat. But he was probably different. The simple fact that he'd enrolled in an offensive magic academy already made him an anomaly. And in reality, his mana wasn't that of a pure healer. Will thought that maybe he hadn't noticed because of the regression. Veronica told him to be aware of that, to embrace the aggressive fury inside him. If he did, his healing magic would surely be capable of crushing enemies. The next day on the training grounds, Will was still thinking about what Veronica had said. Her analogy had been strange, but it was a real eye-opener. He wondered why she hadn't shown any resistance to the idea of a healer using offensive magic, and it was odd that she already had a theory ready for it. The instructor cut through his thoughts. Since the class had an odd number of students, Will would also be taking part in that day's sparring matches. The fact that he couldn't use offensive magic was his problem. Even if he took a one-sided beating, he'd reap what he sowed, and the matchups had already been decided. Will face. It was an obvious setup. Omen came from a well-known noble family, and was always surrounded by lackeys. But from what Will had observed in class, Opulpus wasn't just a name. He was a genuine battle mage. Opus shouted that healing magic didn't work against humiliation, and that Will would be running home, crying after taking a beating. Will found his personality irritating in a way he hadn't expected. In the past, he would have ignored it. But this time, the guy actually got under his skin. He wanted to test Veronica's theory anyway, and maybe hit back a little. He addressed Opulpus formally and said he wouldn't accept a forfeit. Will replied that he had no intention of giving up, but he had a proposal. If he lost the fight, he would acknowledge that he had no talent for offensive magic and leave Schwarz. The instructor said that was a wise decision. Will continued, but if he won, he wanted permission to attend regular classes. The instructor asked what kind of nonsense that was. Alpus shouted that a weakling was clinging to an impossible illusion just to face his fear, and that if there was nothing to break, there'd be no fun in it at all. The instructor shut down the discussion. Impossible hypotheticals were a waste of time. Both of them should take their positions. He raised his hand and called for the match to begin. Alpus focused, summoning several daggers around him. He shouted for Will to behold his blade creation magic. Countless swords conjured from nothing, ready to strike a quitter who couldn't even use basic offensive magic. Will focused right after. He channeled his healing magic, opened his eyes with full concentration, and started dodging the blade from side to side. Opus was surprised. Will reflected as he moved. The true essence of his healing magic was the manipulation of life, controlling vital activity and maximizing the body's natural healing power. But healing wasn't the only thing he could control. If he converted that into an offensive form, Opus shouted at him to stop acting like he was something special just because he got lucky. Will activated physical reinforcement. He grabbed one of the blades midair and in a single motion knocked all the others aside. They froze suspended for a moment before dropping to the floor with a dry clatter. That's exactly what I needed. He positioned the dagger in front of him and said he was borrowing it. He was ready to fight. The crowd had no idea what had just happened. Someone asked if that was offensive magic. Will thought no, it was healing magic used offensively. Apparently, no one else could tell the difference. Opulpus wasn't having it. He shouted that Will had to be kidding that he could summon way more blades than that. A battle mage couldn't lose to a healer. Will pressed forward, deflecting every blade that came at him. Opus grew even more frustrated. It's not about quantity, he declared. He was going to make the swords bigger. He wanted to see what Will thought of that. Will blocked with the dagger. Opus shouted in disbelief and pushed harder. He added spin to the blades and threw everything he had. Will figured he'd have to push the physical reinforcement up a little. He blocked the strike. Alpus shouted that it was impossible. I'll heal myself properly after. Will looked at him. Forgive me. He moved the dagger. A wall of sand rose between them. Both stepped back, caught off guard. The teacher had stepped in. The sand was his. He said there were still other matches to get through and told them both to stand out. Will looked coldly at Alpus on the ground and asked if he could join the regular classes from next time. Alpus gritted his teeth and told him to do whatever he wanted. Will thanked him. As he walked away, he thought about what he had just felt. That was his form of offensive magic, and it had worked better than he expected since he had beaten a talented battle mage his own age. All thanks to Professor Veronica. There was a path for a healer to become a battle mage. He could become a battle mage. He looked up at the academy's flag. Opulpus muttered to the teacher that what happened was an accident during class and could become a problem. He said he really didn't want to have to report every detail to his father and that the teacher should understand what that meant. The teacher agreed. They couldn't have a healer acting arrogant around there. In the classroom, Will thought that he could finally attend classes. He was going to learn everything there was to know about offensive magic. The teacher walked in, glanced briefly at Will, and turned back to face the class. He announced that the lesson would be about magical tool creation. They were going to assemble ice bombs. He would hand out the materials, and they should follow the instructions while infusing mana. Will recognized the format. At the Healer Academy, there was a similar class, but there they only made potions and recovery items. It made sense that here they were making weapons. They probably expected everyone to infuse dynamic mana, but for magical tool creation, the nature of the mana didn't matter as much. Most of it depended on the materials. He should be able to handle this class without any trouble. He started adding the powdered flame tree branch to the ice golem fragment. Then the mana stone began to glow differently. Will threw it away with physical reinforcement. The explosion shook the back of the room. Will lay on the floor surrounded by ice spikes, staring at the ceiling like an idiot. The professor called him out on the spot. He wanted to know what Will thought he was doing. Will explained that the stone had activated before he even infused it with mana. But the professor wasn't interested in excuses. He was docking points from his grade. Laughter came from the back of the room. Opulpus laughed along with everyone else, staring at Will with that strange expression. Will glared back. In the next class on magical creatures, a salamander stood right in front of him. The professor warned that students with low grades should sit in the front row and pay close attention. Will had barely finished processing how close he was to that thing when the salamander spat fire at him. He blocked it with a pot. The professor asked why he was holding a cauldron. Will said it was necessary. The cauldron was confiscated, so that's how they want to play it. Will thought. They let him sit through classes, but they have no intention of letting him actually learn anything. A girl was watching him from a distance with a slightly uneasy expression. The harassment didn't stop there. The professor kept calling on Will to answer questions about material he had never seen. Outside the classroom, someone told the instructor that Will had been misbehaving, and he went without dinner because of it. Back in the dorm, Will lay down staring at the ceiling. The wind was blowing against him at this school, and it was relentless. There was still a mountain of problems ahead, but he was making progress, and he couldn't let this petty harassment get in the way of that. On top of that, he had fought with his own hand for the first time and won. He really could become a battle mage. He had also gotten a textbook. He needed to go over the day's material. The next day, Will arrived at the classroom, and there was no one there. It was time for class, but the professor hadn't shown up. The only other person there was that girl from before. It seemed like the class had moved rooms, and no one had bothered to tell them. Will walked over and excused himself. He asked if she thought the classroom had been moved. She said she had been thinking the same thing. Then she added since she was the only one there with Will, the student, the professor, and everyone else hated. She figured that was exactly it. I think we're on the same side, she said. Hated loners go well together. Will found the line a bit sharp, but her tone was grim enough to feel sincere. Either way, he was glad to make a friend. He said it was nice to meet her. She said the pleasure was hers. Her name was Erica Glenn. Will told her she was his first friend at the academy. Erica replied that in that case, it was hard to avoid. After all, he barely attended classes, and on top of everything, he was a healer. Everyone said healers were weaklings. She herself attended every class and was a battle mage, but she didn't have any friends either. Well, thought about that. Setting her personality aside, the discrimination against healers ran deep. In his past life, he had been recognized too quickly to ever face that kind of thing. But in an academy that specialized in offensive magic, the prejudice was strong, and studying there meant having to fight against it too. Erica sighed and asked why he had come to Schwarz. Will said that being born a healer was no reason to stay out of the fight. Erica looked surprised. He said he had his reasons and asked why she had come. Erica explained that she came from a small noble family in the countryside. No boys had been born, and her parents were worried about the family line dying out. They figured that if she could make a name for herself as a mage, she might be able to take on the role of family head. Will said he understood. Graduating from Schwarz would certainly make that possible. Erica admitted she had almost no talent for offensive magic. Because of that, she couldn't make friends. Classes were painful, and it was just the worst. But now she had made a friend. As long as she had Will, an even bigger failure than herself, she wouldn't feel so insecure about her bad grades. Will said things might not turn out the way she was thinking. Erica asked what he meant. Will answered that first they needed to find a room where class was actually happening. Erica decided to follow him. In the classroom, Will announced they had arrived. The professor responded coldly that they were late. Class had started a long time ago. Will apologized, explaining they hadn't known about the room change. The professor wasn't interested in excuses, and since Will was there, told him to solve the problem on the board. Erica was outraged. They had just arrived. How were they supposed to know? And Will had barely had any classes yet. Will looked at the board. The professor warned that if he got it right, the matter would be dropped, but if he got it wrong, he'd lose points. Alpus commented that at this rate, Will would fail out in no time. Even so, Will picked up the chalk. He started writing. The class watched in silence, some already expecting him to fail, but Will finished, turned to the professor with a complete magic circle on the board, and asked what he thought. The professor was surprised. It was correct. He told Will to sit down, and Alpus let out a gasp of shock. Erica couldn't understand how he had done that. Will returned to his seat with a calm smile and kept following the lesson. After class, Erica ran after him, wanting to know how he had solved the problem. Will explained that it looked complex, but it was just an application of the examples in the book he had studied ahead of time. Erica asked if he had read that book on his own. Will confirmed he had read it the day before. The Schwarz textbook was flawless. It covered everything from the basics to advanced applications. No fluff, exactly what you'd expect from the best magic academy. Just reading it was enough. On top of that, he had always been good at theory, and the reasoning he carried from his past life helped a lot when it came to understanding offensive magic. He ended up staying up late, but it was fun. Erica's jaw dropped. The material was too dense to absorb without a professor, and she had thought Will was the weakest student in the class. If he was at that level, where did that leave her? She asked him not to leave her behind. Will placed a hand on her shoulder and said it was fine. He'd teach her whatever she didn't understand. They were friends, after all. Erica thanked him. Will thought to himself that he hadn't come to Schwarz to make friends, but having Erica around opened up possibilities, so he told her he needed a favor in return. Classes weren't just theory. The next one was general offensive magic, which was exactly why he had failed and been removed from every class before. He could manage now. He had even beaten Alpus, but general offensive magic was still out of his reach. He had a plan, and he needed her help. He explained the difference. General offensive magic used formulas that had already been analyzed and structured accessible to anyone who learned them. Unique magic, on the other hand, was created within the user and only worked for that specific person. Schwarz had separate classes for each. For unique magic, there was no single right answer, and there he could get by using his offensive healing magic. But for general offensive magic, without casting the spell, there was no passing grade. The professor confirmed it plainly. Will might have done well on the written portion, but the practical side was a different story. If he didn't cast offensive magic, he'd fail. The task was simple. Hit the target with a fireball, the most basic spell of all. Without that, he could forget about advancing or graduating. The professor suspected Will had used healing magic in a mock battle. And the story about movements improving after healing even made some sense, but general offensive magic was something else entirely. Someone as incompetent as him should just leave the class. Then the professor noticed something. Will was smiling, and there was fire in the palm of his hand. Will felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The professor hadn't noticed. The day before when he was with Erica, Will had asked her to create a fireball using general offensive magic. He stored the spell inside a salamander tail and hid the tail in his own hand while healing it so it wouldn't burn. Erica wanted to know if that was even possible for a healer and just who the hell Will was. A moment before releasing the spell, Will use healing magic to activate the flame charge stored inside the salamander tail. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a fireball had been conjured right there in the palm of his hand. The projectile flew straight and burned the training dummy. We'll turn to the professor with a calm smile and asked what he thought. The professor stared for a moment. That was definitely the flame of a standard spell. The boy might have actually learned it. Will passed. He could return to the line. Erica's jaw dropped, ground his teeth. Later in the classroom, got straight to the point. What was going on here? The professor said he'd like to know as well. Opulpus wasn't interested in explanations. A healer had dared to challenge him, and he wasn't going to put up with sharing a class with that guy. If he had to, he'd tell his father, and the whole class would be done. The professor tried to reason that it was a bit much. Alpus cut him off. Use whatever means necessary, but get that guy out of his sight. Alpus left. The professor stayed alone in the room, thinking trying something outside of class was risky. If he got caught, it wouldn't be the same as some spoiled rich kid throwing his weight around. But sometimes you had to take risks to protect your own position. A mere healer acting like he owned the place, and he still didn't even know what the other professors were up to. He wasn't going to let that boy ruin his life. He'd have to deal with him personally. After school at the training grounds, the professor got straight to it. He figured was feeling pretty good about himself, and that wasn't a compliment. He'd missed several classes since enrollment began. How did he plan to make up for that? Well, thought about throwing it back in his face that the absences were the professor's own fault, but decided it wasn't worth it. He explained that he'd asked a classmate for the missed material and studied on his own to cover everything. There was no problem. The professor didn't move. In cases of absence, supplementary lessons were mandatory, and the content was decided by the instructor in charge. It would be a simulated battle against him personally. Will took a second to process that a professor fighting a student. The professor said he'd give him an advantage. Considering the difference in skill, landing just a single hit would be enough to pass. Since he was being so generous, there was no reason to run. What the professor didn't say out loud was what he was thinking. With that magic, the boy's attacks would never get close. All he had to do was beat him until he understood the difference in strength. Then he'd listen to what he had to say. Will agreed he'd do it. The professor smiled and activated his magic. Will had seen that magic once before. It was the one that lifted the ground. He dodged quickly, but a strike came from above too. He ducked, and the next one came from below again. The professor asked with contempt if running was all he knew how to do. Will straightened up, analyzing the situation. Unlike creation magic, this style manipulated the existing ground itself. That's why it was so fast, and the range of attack angles was enormous. But it wasn't unavoidable. He leaped, dodged the strikes, and pushed forward. The professor activated another magic circle on the ground, raising walls on either side of Will to trap him between them. He smiled. Will used the walls as leverage and jumped over them, closing in with his weapon in hand. But when he got close enough to land a hit, the professor turned to stone. Will pulled back from the spikes. The professor said the boy was weak. He couldn't even break through his absolute form with that level of power. He'd never heard of a healer using healing magic to attack, but it was just a cheap imitation. Wanting to be a battle mage with such pathetic magic was almost laughable. Will responded calmly. Through healing magic, he had studied the human body in depth and learned that humans generally live while unconsciously holding back their own strength. The reason was simple. The body can't withstand its own full power. If someone tried to exert a force beyond that limit, their own body would break. The professor shot back with contempt. Will was just trying to lecture him because he couldn't win against offensive magic. Will calmly replied that either way, even removing the limiter to release more strength, the body would come out damaged. But he was a healer. It didn't matter if his arm broke. The professor was caught off guard. Will stepped closer with a crooked smile, saying he hated pain, but he could just heal himself on the spot. So, let them test it right now. He moved with full force. The hit landed clean, and the professor's glasses flew through the air. Will said it wasn't a good idea to decide a student's limits in an arbitrary way. He had learned that when Professor Veronica suggested using healing magic offensively, and there was nothing more foolish than declaring something impossible, he could become much stronger. But before he could finish the sentence, Will turned sharply and dodged a strike coming from the professor. They stood face to face. The professor was holding his own glasses, visibly furious. Will said he figured the professor would approve if he landed just one hit. The professor told him to shut up. There were no witnesses around. Admitting he had taken a punch from a healer was something he couldn't accept, and he launched a volley of stones. Will remarked that releasing the limiter wasn't just for punching. He drove his foot into the ground and shot toward the professor at an absurd speed. The professor barely had time to process it. The stone wall wasn't rising fast enough. He squeezed his eyes shut, then looked to the side, trying to figure out if the movement had stopped, but he couldn't move. The hits kept coming. and time seemed to have slowed down around him. He pleaded mentally for Will to stop. The pain was unbearable, far worse than being hit at normal speed. He couldn't escape, couldn't even scream. He just begged in silence for it to end. Then he was thrown back. His body hit the ground hard. Will walked over and said that for him, it had only been an instant. The professor, still on the ground, demanded Will explain what he had done. Will replied that unlike the professor, he could explain it just fine. At the exact moment the punch landed, he had activated sensory enhancement on himself. Originally a healing spell for people with deteriorating vision and hearing. By pushing his reaction speed to an extreme level, his senses became absurdly sharp, making 1 second feel like dozens of separate moments. He had wanted to know how much it hurt to take a hit in that state. Then he asked if he had passed the lesson. The professor said yes. Will added one more thing. He knew it would be hard to get rid of deep-rooted prejudices, but if the professor kept going down that path, he would make sure the man got well acquainted with exactly what kind of pain his own body was capable of feeling. All he wanted was to attend classes without being bothered by other students. Could the professor guarantee that? Later, in the hallways of Schwarz Academy, the professor walked alone, still trying to process what had happened. He had always believed healers were weak with no combat ability, meant to obey offensive mages. But what was different? He didn't just have fighting skill. He had real killing intent. Alpus appeared and asked if the lesson was over, remarking that Will was 1 step closer to expulsion. The professor told him to shut up and to stop messing with Will. Thinking of him as a simple healer was a mistake Alpus couldn't afford to make. Said that wasn't what he wanted to hear and reminded him that if he told his father everything, the professor knew what would happen. The professor told him to go ahead and do it. He paused, thought for a second, then added, if Opulpus went to his father over this, there was a good chance it would be him getting expelled, not Will. Instead of the Omen family making their move as expected, it seemed like Will would be the one extending his claws in the future. Opus was left alone in the hallway. He slammed his fist against the wall in frustration, cursing the situation that was closing in around him. A few days later in class, Will yawned. Things were pretty peaceful. The professor had apparently talked to Alpus because he would sometimes glare at Will with resentment, but he never did anything. That let Will focus on his studies, though it wasn't enough. To change humanity's future, he needed to get much stronger. The idea of using healing magic for physical enhancement was solid, but what he was doing was basically just punching and kicking through brute force. Sensory enhancement worked for intimidation, but compared to the versatility of a battle mage, he still had a long way to go. He needed to think of new approaches. He called for Veronica. She said that before anything else, she wanted to tell him something. Will asked what it was. The professor said he had done well. It had become a big topic among the faculty. For a healer, keeping up with classes at Schwarz was quite an achievement, though most of them seemed pretty unhappy about it. Will thought he could have guessed as much. He asked if she was hiding the fact that it was her who had advised him. Veronica said she wasn't hiding it. She simply hadn't had the chance to say anything to the other professors. Will realized she was also something of an outsider among her colleagues. Even so, he said it was a relief. Everything had been thanks to her advice, and he would have felt terrible if his actions had put her in a bad spot. Veronica replied that she didn't mind that, so he didn't need to worry. And besides, she was grateful. As she had said before, because of the nature of healer spirits, none of them would ever think to put that theory into practice. Then she drew her sword. She said she was curious to see what a combat healer actually looked like. Will asked what she was doing. Veronica replied that she wanted to assess his current state since he wanted advice on how to get stronger. Will said fighting her was a bit much. She replied that there are no breaks on the battlefield and lunged at him. Will was caught off guard and stepped back, but managed to block the strike with a dagger. Veronica's strength began to overpower him. She kept pressing forward blow after blow. Even with his reaction, speed amplified by magic, Will could barely keep up with her. Up close, it was clear it wasn't just speed. Her movements were refined, calculated to unleash a relentless barrage, forcing his body to keep up through physical enhancement alone had its limits. He had one shot, the speed he hadn't shown her yet. He needed to catch Veronica off guard. He focused force into his foot and went for a thrust. Veronica was surprised, but she moved her sword with precision, deflected the strike, dropped low, and cut the blade from his weapon. Will stared at her in surprise as the sword fell to the floor. He let out a slow breath. Veronica sheathed her sword and said she was impressed. She hadn't expected him to force her to use her magic sword. Will said she had barely broken a sweat. She replied that she had assumed he would just be a healer fighting like a battle mage, but he had skills that put him in a different class, someone genuinely talented. Will thanked her. The professor added that she liked the ambition and that he was right. Pure physical effort wasn't enough. Will said that no matter how much he pushed past his body's limits, there was a ceiling to what he could do. Veronica replied that a sword isn't only for striking. It can thrust. It can be thrown aside. There had to be other ways to use what he had. Will said nothing had worked so far, she continued. He probably lacked real combat experience. He needed the feel of actual battle to give shape to his ideas. She asked if he hadn't noticed something during their fight just now. Will asked if he should keep training with her. Veronica said it wasn't a bad idea, but that as it happened, there would be a training exercise coming up soon. Will thought about it. Something similar had existed in his past life, too. The joint training exercise between the three schools, the Offensive Magic Academy Schwarz, the Healing Magic Academy, HEALER, and the Sword Academy Silburn. Students from each school would form groups and take on real subjugation missions. He hadn't participated when he was at HEALER, but in this life, he would take down monsters and change the future. He knew it would be his first real hunt. Veronica stared at him without reacting for a moment, then explained, to participate, he needed to prove his skills in the academy selection exam. She had heard about a student being called a prodigy among that year's freshmen. Will needed to aim for first place before any of that. Will asked how the exam worked. Veronica explained that the candidates fought each other. Around 100 people signed up every year, and those who showed strength were selected. Will took in the information. Everything came down to combat. He figured there would be few candidates willing to participate on their own, but that proactive attitude must have been part of Schwartz's style. The thought brought memories to the surface. He wondered what his mentor was doing now. Veronica added that either way, the so-called prodigy had already surpassed some of the teachers. Reaching first place wouldn't be easy. Will figured the kid must be better than that professor, so he asked if she hadn't met this student in person. Veronica said there was apparently a teacher involved, so no one came with questions. Will sensed that wasn't the only reason. She told him not to worry. She would help with training, too. Will thanked her. The day of the selection exam, Will walked along thinking the day had come in the blink of an eye. He had prepared as much as he could. Now was time. A voice called his name. Will recognized it quickly. Director Al-Nuram Goldran. Al-Nuram said it had been a while and that his granddaughter had been doing well since then. Even though Will had saved the girl, the director regretted not being able to see him after that, and he knew adjusting to Schwarz must have been hard. Will replied that he had struggled at first, but was completely fine now. He added that he was aiming for first place in the exam. The director laughed, saying that was impressive. A voice cut through the air behind them. It was a professor, and the tone had nothing friendly about it. He remarked that this was a joke. This guy wanting first place. As the training supervisor, he said he would love to teach punks like him a lesson. Will recognized him immediately. In his past life, he had crossed paths with this man, the Purple Lightning Goat. Offensive magic that had earned him heroic feats in the Great War. Personally, Will held no good memories of him. Goat went on. Combat was talent, and training and effort couldn't replace that. Being a healer meant Will had no chance of winning. Will stared at him coldly. Al-Nam stepped in, saying the exam would begin shortly and the results would speak for themselves. There was no point in arguing there. Goat agreed in passing and added that either way, the one who would face Will was serious. A young man with long white hair approached. Sirius Blati nodded to the director. Will thought, so this was the prodigy, the opponent he needed to defeat to reach first place. The two looked at each other, and there was something lit up in both their eyes. Al-Nam remarked that hot blood was good, but it was already time. They should head in. Everyone walked toward the arena. The other students buzzed in the stands as the participants lined up in rows. Will noticed Erica among them and asked if she was participating. She replied that if she didn't, they would cut her attendance in some classes. Opus fixed Will with a look heavy with anger. Will smiled at Erica, who made it clear she would rather be anywhere else. Elnam took the floor, saying he was proud to see so many participants once again that year. He asked them to let passion and fighting spirit guide their hearts. He explained that the preliminary round was a survival match. Whoever lasted until the end would advance to the main event. Will ran the numbers in his head. 100 people on a battlefield. A lot of people. Al-Naram anticipated the reaction and told them not to worry about the numbers. Then he raised his staff. A massive portal opened beneath everyone's feet. The ground turned into a starry sky. The students looked around, unable to understand what was happening. Alaram announced that off they went. Will appeared in the middle of a forest. He recognized the place. It must have been the one behind the academy. A voice sounded nearby, asking if he could hear. The teleportation had scattered everyone on their own. They should avoid strong enemies and cooperate with anyone they knew. Starting positions depended on luck. Will muttered that a spell capable of teleporting 100 people at once was just absurd. The director ignored the comment and declared the selection exam had begun. Will jumped immediately, landing on top of a branch. He compressed his presence to a minimum, suppressing his vital signs so he wouldn't be detected. But when he looked back, there were already 3 students fighting each other close by. One of them ordered his golem to advance. A girl ran toward the two of them with a magic hammer in hand. A third one, blonde, unleashed a blizzard and froze both of them in place. Will watched everything carefully. It was a good opportunity to study a variety of offensive spells. It would be a waste to stay on the defensive, just trying to pass the test. And besides, he wanted to test a few things himself. The golem boy defeated the other two. He celebrated out loud, saying, "Everyone must have seen how strong his golem was." Will appeared behind him before he finished the sentence. He grabbed his head firmly and activated the consciousness disruption spell. The boy passed out on the spot. Will looked at him for a second. The technique manipulated the flow of life to force the opponent to black out. It required direct contact with the head, so it was hard to use without a clear difference in power, but it neutralized without causing any injury. Professor Veronica would be pleased. He turned and dodged a series of knives that cut through the air toward him, embedding in the ground all around. Will sighed. "Ulpus, you never learn." The noble said he didn't know what he was talking about, that he just wanted to pass the exam, and that he was going to use everything he had to do it. The two companions behind Ulpus moved in together. Conjure knives with his magic formulas. The second coated the blades with poison. The third replicated everything with shadows, multiplying the poison knives several times over. Bulpus warned that the knives would pierce skin at the slightest touch. In that quantity, it didn't matter how fast Will was. He wouldn't be able to dodge all of them. The blades were launched. Will calculated quickly. He could neutralize the poison with healing magic. But taking scratches from all of that, even with physical enhancement, was going to be a problem. He activated the healing spell in his hand. Then something threw itself in front of him. The golem blocked everything, absorbing the knives like a shield. Alpus didn't understand. The golem belonged to the boy Will had taken down. Will figured out what had happened. Healing magic normally only works on living beings, but the golem operated through a mechanism powered by the summoner's blood. He couldn't control it with precision, but by injecting life force, he could direct it just enough. The golem advanced on the group. It landed a clean punch on one of the subordinates and sat on top of the other. Alpus complained that his men had been beaten down so easily. Will was already in front of him. He grabbed his face with one hand. "Good night." Alpus blacked out. In another part of the forest, the golem was facing a water spell. Will watched from a distance, satisfied. Physical enhancement limited him to close-range combat, but the golem covered exactly that weakness, and there was still time left to study the other students' spells. Then a hurricane formed at one corner of the forest. Will frowned. What was that now? The gust came toward them. Will jumped to dodge, and the cyclone swept through. The golem and the students nearby were knocked down all at once. When Will landed, he looked to the side. Someone was approaching. It was serious, exactly as Will had expected. Impressive skill, someone who wouldn't be easy to beat. Will was still weighing whether it was worth testing that when the director's voice cut through the air. Enough effort. The preliminaries were over, and all four had passed. The main event would be the following day in the arena. For now, they could take care of themselves. The teleport spell would activate in moments. Will watched his rival from a distance. Sirius did the same, holding his gaze without looking away until he disappeared along with the others. Will couldn't wait for the next day either. Back in his dorm room, he opened his journal and wrote a few things down. What he could do before the main event, what he needed to think about. The night was quiet. Outside in the hallway, not so much. A few nobles were grumbling among themselves. That guy was way too strong, and he'd even healed everyone who'd been knocked out. Wasn't that enough to make them give up? The two of them to shut up. They came from weak families, so they didn't understand. The Omen family's teachings were clear. Healers had no place among real mages. If anyone found out he was being held back by a healer, what would his father say? The other two exchanged a look. They said he could do whatever he wanted, but they weren't getting hurt over it anymore, and they walked off down the hallway without looking back. Alopus stood there, anger simmering. He didn't need magic to get rid of Will. In his room, Will was studying as usual when a knock came at the door. Too late for a normal visit. He felt something was off before he even opened it. It was Alopus. He wished him a good evening with a smile, and asked if Will didn't think the moon looked beautiful tonight. Will got straight to the point. What was he planning? The noble replied that he just wanted a peaceful conversation. He said with an almost relaxed honesty that he hated healers, and that he'd already done quite a lot to get Will expelled from the academy. Will figured he'd neutralized most of it. Said he was tired of going around in circles. The message was simple. Will should leave Schwarz. Will said that at least he respected the honesty, but he wanted to understand why put so much effort into making him the villain. Alpus shot back that he didn't need a reason to mistreat healers. It was no different in the Omen family. Anyone born a healer was sent to the remote branch. Opulpus' older brother was one of them. Even when people mocked him, the guy just laughed. An offensive mage and a pathetic healer were completely different things. Will said those were deeply rooted teachings for such a prestigious family. Opulpus agreed without irony. And that was exactly why Will should leave Schwarz. That was no place for healers. Will asked if Opus really thought he was just going to say yes. Opus said he'd make him say it. There was a family Will want to protect, wasn't there? The servants outside had already done their research. Will had grown up with his sister in a remote village. He must miss her quite a bit. If Opus gave the right instructions, what would happen to her? He left the question hanging. Then he stepped closer and asked if he'd managed to convince Will now. Will said yes. Opus told him to go pack his things immediately. That was when he felt his neck being grabbed. Will threw him back and twisted his arm into a position that left no way out. Alpus begged him to stop. He was going to break his arm. Will said he'd already made his decision. The crack came. Alulpus started breathing in gasps, his voice coming out in fragments. If he showed up with a broken arm like this, the academy wouldn't stay quiet. Neither would Will's father. Will said it was fine and healed the arm. Opulus realized what had happened and looked up, confused and relieved for a second until the next crack. Will had broken it again. He said he'd heal it and break it again as many times as it took until Alpus asked him to stop. Alpus asked. Will let go of his arm and spoke calmly. Coming after him was one thing that he could handle. But if Opulpus started going after his sister, he would never let it go. So it was better for the noble to beg sincerely from the bottom of his heart, while Will was still only breaking his spirit. Puss stayed on the floor, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A demon wearing a healer's face. He never should have gotten involved with that guy, because what awaits is something worse than death. And so the night passes. The protagonist tells Alpus not to forget the promise. No laying a hand on him ever again. Will stretches out in his room and thinks that honestly, that was a little refreshing, but now he's going to sleep until the next day comes. A few hours later, the main event finally begins. Alarm calmly takes everything in from his seat. Bode and Veronica settle in nearby. Will watches the situation and thinks that the four who made it through the preliminaries are going to face each other in one-on-one battles. Even so, he can't believe she actually made it through. He turns around and finds Erica standing right in front of him. The girl explains that she built walls of fire and used that strategy without having to defeat anyone directly. Will thinks back the offensive mages ran from the start, but she couldn't have survived just doing that. Erica smiles and says that since they're friends, he could go easy on her. Will says no. She fires back that she made it through the preliminaries on her own and is now aiming for a high evaluation. A professor announces the start of the battle. Erica prepares a fire spell and casts it straight at Will. He blocks with his own arms, thinking it was orthodox fire. That kind of flame he can regenerate through easily. He even feels a little sorry for Erica because he's just going to have to hit her. But then he notices something is off. There is something different about the fire. Erica launches another fireball and warns him it's not over. Will dodges to the side and realizes the flames that hit him before still haven't gone away. That was Erica's unique magic. Fire with an abnormal persistence. The raw power is average, but if he keeps getting hit repeatedly, it'll be dangerous even with healing. When he saw the walls of flame earlier, he thought it was just a property of the salamander tail, but it was Erica's influence. Now, he understands how she created barriers so hard to break, and in a way, that reflects her stubborn personality perfectly. The crowd goes wild. Everyone shouts that she's good and that she's going to take down the healer. Erica wonders for a moment if she can really beat Will, but quickly pushes the thought aside. She made it through the preliminaries, too. She tells him it's time to surrender. Will says it's fine and that he was just about to counter. He heals his own hand as he speaks. Erica activates another spell, declaring it's time to make sure. Will breaks into a grin. If the flames won't disappear, he'll use them to attack. Erica watches the flames wrap around his fists. Will moves toward her. The girl holds out her hands and says she surrenders. She drops to her knees. The winner is announced. Will thinks that even after winning, healers still don't get any respect. The crowd shouts at Erica not to give up like that if she still calls herself an offensive mage. Erica looks at the crowd and says they were cheering for her just a moment ago. She's sorry about that. Will helps her up and tells her not to worry. He thinks she fought well. She has a good chance of passing. Her eyes light up, but Bode appears behind her and cuts the moment short. Come to think of it, he says healers are worthless trash. Surrendering to trash makes her something worse than trash. She clearly failed, so she should get out. Will asks if that way of speaking isn't a little inappropriate for students. Bode replies that he's the battlefield supervisor and that if the participants show a low level, but he's already walking away as he speaks, leaving the thought unfinished. He tosses over his shoulder that it looks like only one person is going to advance. Sirius appears behind Will and speaks to him. Will wonders when he got there and thinks this guy also knows how to talk. He wants to know if Sirius thinks the same as Professor Bode. Sirius answers that in the end, Strength is everything, and that Professor Bode was right because he is strong. Will says he understands, but Sirius adds that he doesn't think Will is weak either, so he'd better be right about that. Will watches him with a serious look. Serious blue note. In his past life, Will had heard of an absurdly powerful offensive mage the same age as him, operating on the northern frontier. The wind he created destroyed everything in its path, reducing it all to nothing. And in the final match between the two of them, Will was the one who won. Will says that judging by Professor Bode's attitude, it seems like he won't be recognized unless he wins. So he's going to win. Sirius says he understands. The professor announces the start of the exam. Sirius focuses all his energy and launches it toward Will. Will dodges by throwing himself to the side, pushes off the ground hard, and charges at his opponent. Sirius stays completely still and blasts him away with a gust of wind. Will puts his hand out in front to protect himself, thinking he understands the pattern, but he can't get close enough. The two of them face each other. Sirius remarks that Will is fast, which is a problem. He prepares another spell and releases another blast of wind. Will realizes that unlike the tornado, this blast sends everything flying away. If he takes a direct hit, he'll be thrown out of the arena. It's time to use that. He touches the ground. A tree bursts from the ground, growing in seconds into a massive structure right in front of him. Erica's eyes go wide. That was healing magic, too. Will had gotten even stronger. Will keeps a smile on his face and asks what Veronica thinks. Veronica looks at the tree and starts to speak, but Will cuts her off. He explains that he channeled life force into the plants and made them grow rapidly. He learned about offensive plant magic at the bookstore and figured he might be able to apply it. With that, he has several tactics depending on the type of plant. Then he starts losing consciousness and falls into Veronica's arms. She asks if he's all right. Will confirms it, wondering if he had drained his mana. The book didn't say it was such a heavy technique. Veronica says exactly what she was thinking. Destroying is easier than healing. Healing magic consumes far more magical power, and recreating something with it is probably more inefficient than using regular offensive magic. Will acknowledges that he needs to choose carefully when to use it. He never had the talent for offensive magic to offset the cost, but he pushed past his own limit. On the other side, Sirius raises his hand and releases wind blasts that split the tree in two. Will analyzes the pattern as he watches. A tornado that hurls enemies away. A blast that explodes the sides. Wind blades for large structures. Anyone who gets close gets hit by the tornado. Powerful spells with no openings. Exactly what you'd expect from a top candidate. But Will has already decided he's going to get stronger too. He leaps towards Sirius. Sirius says it doesn't matter how many times he tries, he'll never reach him. Will is sent flying again. Even so, a smile spreads across his face. Sirius doesn't understand. And then a tree hits him in the shoulder. Sirius doesn't understand what just happened. Will explains. The tornado protects the surrounding space, but not the underground. The plant sends roots through the soil, and they grow anywhere. Sirius looks ahead, holding his injured shoulder. Will asks if he really cares that much about Professor Bode. The two always seemed completely incompatible. Sirius answers that Bode is strong and teaches him. Will pushes back, saying he wouldn't need that. He comes from a prestigious family, but Sirius explains that in his family, magical ability is everything. Age and gender don't matter. The strongest becomes the leader, and everyone else is a rival in the fight for succession. His father never taught him magic. Will understands, and Sirius adds that why he follows the professor. It's the most direct path to getting stronger. Then he asks if they're done because his shoulder is killing him. Everyone is caught off guard by how casually he said it. Will looks up with a smile. Behind Sirius, a wind dragon begins to take shape. Sirius says he'll handle this and launches the dragon toward the protagonist. Will recognizes how serious the attack is. Lately, he's been thinking about this. Offensive mages tend to hold back in training matches. That's exactly why he pushes himself to fight for real. Having talent, a good family, or a hard past doesn't make anyone better. Everyone has something, and that's precisely why he wants to beat Sirius for real right now. Sirius asks what that was about. Will says he was just thinking out loud, but now he's going to use his best seed. Vines shoot up in front of him. Leaves unfold in the same instant. Will summons the Yggdrasil, the world tree, with everything he has. Normally, it would take a long time to grow like this, and forcing that growth drains far more magical power than any other plant. But the more power he puts in, the more power it carries. The tree charges toward the dragon. The dragon splits the tree in two and keeps coming. Sirius sighs. He watches the pieces of the tree fly through the air, and they start to glow in the sunlight. Sirius doesn't understand. How is it still in one piece? Will explains, this plant has an absurd vitality. Even a single branch can keep growing without stopping. While Sirius was generating the dragon, his defense was wide open and the world tree didn't waste the opening. The ignoral hits Sirius dead on. Sirius crashes to the ground. Injured, Will points a blade at him. Sirius says he lost. The announcement rings out. The winner is Will. The crowd buzzes with excitement. The healer beats Sirius in a direct duel. Maybe he really is strong. Sirius stares at the ground and sighs. Will reaches out a hand, saying it was close. Exactly what you'd expect from Prodigy. Sirius replies that it still wasn't good enough. Will doesn't get it. It was a great fight. Before he can say anything else, Bode appears and hits Sirius with a lightning strike. The boy goes down even harder. Bode kicks the tree off him, then pulls him in his arms and tells him he failed and that he'll train him again. The crowd murmurs that he has a really harsh way about him. Bode turns to everyone and says the same goes for any idiot watching. He can't accept a healer finishing in first place. Dead silence. Will questions whether this is going too far. He's the one who won, but that doesn't mean Sirius is weak. It was a good fight, and if they fought again, Bode cuts him off. He says Will shouldn't even bother responding to him. Talking about a good fight, about future potential. That's nonsense. On the battlefield, ability is everything. Whoever loses gets treated like trash and loses their life. Simple as that. Will thinks that Bode is doing this to his own student. Then he speaks. He defeated Sirius and proved his ability. Being a healer doesn't mean being weak. Bode replies that this level of strength. In the past, Bode and his classmates pinned Will against the wall. Will said that healers don't fight, but they can help everyone with their healing magic. It was a division of roles, and without teamwork, humanity would perish. Bode was silent for a moment. Then he spoke. His students stood on the front lines to buy time while the others escaped. But those cowards were taken down by small monsters as they ran. The students who stayed behind and fought with nothing to gain lost their lives, and the healers couldn't even reach the battlefield, let alone save them. For trash like them, that was exactly why Sirius had died. Bode drew back his fist, eyes welling up. We'll acknowledge that Bode was right. Being weak means you can't do anything when it counts. But in an era where monsters will only keep getting more dangerous, the strong can't afford to be selfish. Will clenched his fist and said, people like him who have nothing need to become strong. Then he asked directly, if he defeated Professor Bode, would he be recognized? Bode broke into a smile. He said that once a match was declared, all the weak should step aside. The narrator noted that Bode couldn't admit out loud that he wanted a real fight, but the young man made it clear that when it came to the selection, the rules would be his. The presenter looked at Will. Will simply nodded. The narrator sighed and announced the special match. Professor Bode versus Will. Bode cracked his knuckles and warned that he was going to prove his opponent's level was truly low. Will knew his magic was nearly at its limit and that he was facing the strongest opponent yet. There was no way to win normally. He needed to heal himself first. But Bode was already closing in, saying he was far too slow. A purple bolt lit up Will's face and struck him with full force. Bode looked ahead and laid out the 3 reasons his victory was absolute. Distance to suppress the enemy, speed to prevent any reaction, and power to finish it in a single blow. The opponent can't do anything, and the battle ends. Then he remarked, almost bored, that Will couldn't even hear him anymore. Will asked where that finishing blow was. He was still standing. Will knew about B's unique lightning magic. To minimize the damage, he needed to redirect the current away from his body's core. No matter how powerful the strike, if the brain burns out, no healing magic can fix it. So, he created a blood circuit that conducted the electricity quickly. Taking it in through his arm and dispersing it through his leg reduced the impact. He could handle it. It was time to counter. Bode scoffed with arrogance. He said Will had managed to hold on, but barely, and in terrible shape. Will activated his physical enhancement, but his mana ran out the next instant, and he felt his body lock up. He couldn't channel any strength at all. Bode explained there was an absolute rule. Anyone struck by the purple bolt gets paralyzed and can't move. Will moved anyway, warning that was going to be a problem. Bode kept smiling. He said that come to think of it, Will had been doing just fine a moment ago. Another bolt hit him. In the stands, Erica clasped her hands together, crying. Will cursed the situation. Bode was genuinely strong. His unique magic had no openings, and all that arrogance made sense now. Even so, Will got back up. He was determined to win. He announced that this was his last seed and his last spell. He activated plant manipulation and shouted for the tree to grow. The aquatic treasure tree sprouted in front of him. Will calculated it absorbs large amounts of water from the ground. Used as a shield, it would disperse the electricity. Bode demanded to know what that was. Will looked up just as surprised as the other students. Bode simply split the tree in 2. Will admitted he had no way out. Bode walked closer with a mocking smile. asking if that was his last move. Ending with a defensive technique was pathetic, but then he noticed something beside the tree. Mushrooms were starting to sprout all over the splitwood. What is this? Bode muttered. Will could barely believe it had worked so well. Some plants and mushrooms grow faster after lightning strikes. When a forest burns to ash, they're the first to appear with no competition. That mushroom was one of them, but that wasn't its only trait. Bode stared at the mushrooms with a strange look. A second later, his expression changed. My body feels weak. That was the opening we'll needed. He focused his energy and closed the distance between them at a frightening speed. Bode smiled. He threw a punch loaded with lightning straight at him. Will spat blood and went down. Idiot, Bode said, not even bothering to look his way. Obviously, I'm superior in close combat, too. My unique magic manipulates electricity. If I reinforce my own body and move at enhanced speed, a paralysis effect is nothing. Will lay on the ground, thinking that even after all of that, he still hadn't managed to win. So, this is your defeat, Bode said, closing in again with his electrified fist raised. A blade appeared pointed at him. Veronica was standing behind Bode, sword in hand, voice steady. Enough. This has gone too far, Professor Bode. The professor let out a heavy, irritated sigh. Veronica, you shouldn't interfere. You're a new hire. The match has already been decided, she replied. Continuing only serves to hurt him. This guy can heal his own wounds. He can keep going, can he? Veronica didn't back down. If he had magic to spare, sure, but he has no stamina left. He's just wasting my fighting spirit. Veronica released her energy. He did the same. The two moved toward each other. Enough. The voice came from above. Alniram landed between them, hovering for a moment before touching the ground. The two of you fighting here is the real nonsense, he said, looking directly at Bode. Stop this. The principal's gaze left no room for argument. Bode looked away. Fine. Alniram turned to Veronica. I owe you an apology. I didn't explain the situation properly to you. He cleared his throat and straightened up. With that, the main event of the selection camp is over. Everyone may leave. The students began filing out of the Coliseum. Will tried to heal himself on the spot, but cursed his lack of magic. The recovery was barely moving, and he didn't want to accept that. Before he could push further, Veronica lifted him up in her arms. He froze in surprise. You did well, she said. Don't push yourself anymore. Will was speechless for a moment. Then he nodded, turning her words over in his mind as he tried to believe them. It wasn't good enough. The night passed. Will lay awake thinking. That was the ability of a first-class offensive mage. It wasn't just raw power. The level of tactics was completely different, refined in a way he could barely keep up with. And even with people like that, humanity had still fallen. He needed to get stronger. In the morning, he knocked and asked to come in. Will, finally, Alnum said, the injuries are fine, as expected. As soon as my power comes back, I heal on my own. Will replied, then participating in the training camp won't be an issue. You were the winner of the main event, so you'll be taking part. Besides you, Sirius and Erica also passed. Will frowned, but Professor Bode said everyone failed and I didn't win. Alniram gave a half-smile. That happens every year. Alniram explained that it was done on purpose every year. Telling everyone they had failed was a way to create a sense of urgency in the students and push them to their limits. In the end, most of them ended up passing anyway. Will found it strange at first, but made sense when he thought about it more. In his past life, Bode had been one of the heroes who fought on the front lines until the very end, defending humanity, even in a world he disagreed with. That was just who he was, his way of being a good teacher. Alnam went on. Will would be assigned as an offensive mage in a group formed with students from other Mies, and the group would be expected to take on monster subjugation requests. It would be the first time since his regression that Will would face real monsters. 5 years after that point in his past life, monsters have been the direct cause of humanity's destruction. Originally, monster was just a term for any creature with magical power, not necessarily hostile. They sometimes attacked humans, but it was survival instinct, natural competition. From an ecological standpoint, they were neighbors, not always aggressive. But in about 2 years, everything would change with the arrival of the Red Moon. Monsters would become more violent, start banding together across species, and begin killing humans for no reason other than the desire to kill. 2 years after that, the Demon King would descend. Humanity fell at a disadvantage quickly. Nations perished. Offensive mages, the most valuable on the battlefield, died one after another for all kinds of reasons. Knights the same. Even healers who normally stayed far from the front lines were swallowed up by the collapse. Will lost his life. Almost no one who fought survived. Within months, humanity would be on the brink of extinction. He couldn't let that happen again. He needed to become stronger than anyone who had existed in his past life, accumulate enough power to hold back mass invasions, and if possible, find out what had really caused the red moon. Alniram watched Will with a half-smile. You've got a lot of determination, the same eyes as the day we met. He said we'll be fine, and that the teachers were careful about the training field for a reason. There was something he wanted to say specifically to him. Will wasn't quite sure what he meant by that. Outside, he found Erica and Veronica waiting. The three of them were talking when Will noticed more people approaching. Sirius and Professor Bode. Will mentioned that he'd heard Bode's strict teaching style came from how much he cared about his students. Bode stepped closer with a stern expression. I don't know what you're talking about. Weaklings who can't even land a hit on me have no business being arrogant. Will thought the professor hadn't changed one bit. If you understood that, Bode continued, then work hard on the battlefield. Thank you for dealing with Sirius. I'm grateful as well, Sirius replied. Will turned to him and said he was still pretty quiet. Sirius gave a restrained smile. Thank you. Because of that, I was able to focus completely on training and get even stronger. That's Professor B's way of teaching. As long as you survive and manage to get your revenge, it's not a defeat. That's a good lesson, said Will. Get stronger. Sirius broke into a real smile and bumped his fist against Will's before heading toward the carriage. Will thought that having more capable offensive mages was always a good thing and that he would make sure the battles against the monsters went in their favor. Veronica said it was time to go. Will was already on his way. Inside the carriage, Veronica explained the mission. The Dunnel Forest was ahead. This time, the request was to subjugate goblins in the forest. Each group would be made up of 3 students from different Mai's, Schwarz, Hillick, and Silburn, plus 1 teacher from one of the schools of support. Erica asked if the groups were already set. Veronica confirmed that Erica was in the same group as her. Erica thought that was better than being stuck with strangers, even if Veronica made her a little uneasy. The professor mentioned that Will's group also had something different about it, but that they had already arrived. It was better to go see the Silburn participants who were already on site. Will knew who they were from his past life, but they had never been properly introduced. A girl called his name, ran up to him, and hugged him before he could react. I've been waiting for the day I could finally meet you. Will turned red on the spot. Wait a second. I have no idea who you are. The girl stepped back, not looking the least bit offended. That makes sense. We never properly introduced ourselves after all. She straightened up with a smile. My name is Marie Goldran, granddaughter of the director of Schwarz Academy, Alniram Goldran. Will's jaw dropped. Will stood still for a second, processing. So, it was her, the girl he had taken care of. He never imagined they would meet again. He asked how she was doing, and Marie said she was doing great. She apologized for not thanking him properly before, but Will said there was no need. Her grandfather had recommended him to Schwarz in return, so they were even. Marie shook her head. She wanted to repay the favor somehow, too. Since she had no talent for magic, she enrolled in Silburn and threw herself into fencing. The result was reaching the top of the academy exams. Turns out I have a knack for the sword, she said, laughing. Will thought about that from Bedridden to first place in the exams in such a short time. She was absurdly talented. Marie took his hands firmly. You can count on me, Master Will. That's why we ended up in the same group. Will smiled and said they would give it their best together, and he understood in that moment what the director meant when he said he was counting on him. Marie turned suddenly, saying someone from Hillich had arrived and that they should go greet them. Erica commented that their group seemed well put together, and Veronica agreed. The atmosphere was already good. Marie looked around searching for the other group members. She asked if Master Run and Turf had arrived yet. Will recognized the name. The door opened and a man appeared, asking everyone to be patient. They were on their way out. He stopped outside and introduced himself as Master Run, wanting to confirm whether those were the students joining his group. Will felt something tighten in his chest. It was his mentor. In his past life, this man had been his master and the best healer he had ever known. He celebrated internally at being in the same group. Behind Run, a scholarly-looking young man appeared, complaining that the professor still hadn't come down properly. Marie identified him as Master Turf and introduced herself. Turf said it was a pleasure, but his eyes went straight to their joined hands. And you are? Turf asked in a tone that didn't hide the disdain very well. Will from Schwarz, an offensive mage, Turf muttered. Rin stretched without any ceremony and declared that this was their group. They could do as they pleased. He would be watching. Marie frowned, questioning that attitude. Will thought that was exactly how his mentor had always been. He stepped toward Run and asked if he could call him mentor. Rin raised an eyebrow, wanting to know why. Will explained that he could use healing magic, but had never had a teacher for it, and he wanted to learn from him. Rin was surprised, an offensive mage who also used healing. He said he thought he had heard something about that, and that the group's formation seemed intentional. When Will asked if that was all right, Rin shrugged, call me whatever you want. Marie immediately said that if Master Will was calling him that, she would do the same. Turf tried to object, but it was no use. Erica and Veronica exchanged a glance. The group was already way too friendly. Each team received their designated area, with the cabin serving as a base. The goblin territory was a little deeper into the forest. As was customary in combat, healers didn't go to the front line. They would stay at the base. Marie pointed out that Run was a healer, yet he was going along anyway. Rin replied that he was the supervisor, so it was different. They could do as they pleased. He wouldn't be a burden. Marie said she would help him, so he wouldn't have to hold back. Will agreed that meant something. The goblins attacked. Marie swung the massive sword with full force, sweeping enemies in wide arcs. Each strike landed with an absurd impact. When she touched down, there was a pile of goblins collapsed around her. Will looked at her and thought of the girl lying in that bed. How she had gotten here? Marie's fencing was like that. Every hit driven by raw power. Maybe she alone could clear that entire place. There's a big group of them over there, she warned. Rin crossed his arms. Impressive, but full of openings. Great at pushing forward, but when surrounded, she's exposed. Cover her. Will agreed and thought that he was finally going to fight real monsters. One of the goblins charged straight at Marie. Will thought those goblins were genuinely formidable. That tension in your shoulders, Rin said. Relax. Will was surprised, but he agreed. It was just like before. Rin always noticed too much. So, he activated the magic circle, then the physical enhancement right after, and moved in. He leapt between the monsters, cutting with his sword and covering Marie's back without any apparent effort. You can count on me, he said. Marie didn't hesitate to agree. So that's what fighting with healing magic looks like, Rin commented from a distance. Not bad. We'll celebrate it internally. It worked against monsters, too. The knife Professor Veronica had given him carried a different kind of force than Alpus blades. Cleaner, more precise. You spread yourself across explosive power and fencing at the same time, Marie said. It's really impressive. That's enough for today, Rin announced, already walking. Let's move on. Marie mentioned she felt lighter somehow. Will said it was thanks to their mentor. Rin's healing magic had indicators for serious conditions, but his real skill was speed. So casual, so subtle that no one around him even noticed it had been used. That's why non-healers never understood just how extraordinary it was. Will had asked about it once. I don't do it to show off, Rin had answered. If you're healed, that's all that matters. Will said nothing more, but he thought the world hadn't noticed. The greatest healer in the world was Run Kaidos. Later at the group's cabin, Rin reviewed the day. Good group. You all did very well today. Everyone came back without injuries, so I didn't do anything, Turf said. Providing healing through meals is also a healer's duty, Rin replied. And you did that well. The taste was thanks to your special sauce. Marie said the professor was truly incredible. He wasn't just a healer. He seemed to have knowledge of the front lines, too. When you treat a lot of injured people in the field, basic knowledge accumulates naturally, Rin said. That's why the professor rarely shows up for regular classes, Turf added. He's always heading out there. Isn't it dangerous? Marie asked. I have confidence in my ability to run. Pain, insult. Will.